teaching GCSE Latin literature. My name is Karski from King's College School, Wimbledon, and in this video I will primarily focus on the OCR extracts from Aeneid Book 2, but I hope that the various teaching ideas will be beneficial not just for this text, but able to be transferred to other literary works you may teach in the future. By the end of this video you will, hopefully, be familiar with the content of the prescribed section of Aeneid 2, know who the key characters are, and how they are characterized by Virgil, and also pick up some teaching ideas for the text. There are three sections of Book 2 which we cover at GCSE, with the action broadly separated between the first third, lines 506 to 558 dealing with King Priam, and the latter two-thirds dealing with Aeneas and his flight and departure from the city of Troy. Throughout the book, which forms part of a flashback, the narrative is being told by Aeneas as he recounts his departure from Troy to Queen Dido of Carthage. In our first section, the actor centres around the aged King Priam, who vainly arms himself against the besieging Greeks. His wife Hecuba, taking refuge at the sacred altar with her daughters, chides Priam for his futile gesture. Their son Polites races through the palace before being slaughtered at his parents' feet by Neoptolemus, the savage son of Achilles. Despite his old age and frailty, Priam attempts to resist Neoptolemus, but is butchered in front of his family by the younger man. In lines 705 to 740, Aeneas resolves to lead his family from Troy and instructs his servants and retinue to gather at the temple of Ceres. The ever-dutiful Aeneas carries his aged father Anchises, who in turn clings to the household gods, and leads his young son Aeneas by the hand. His wife Creusa follows at a distance. The danger of the besieged city surrounds the fugitives at every step, and Aeneas becomes separated from Creusa. Despite wildly calling for his wife, Aeneas has lost her from his sights. Shortly after, in lines 768 to 794, the spectral image of Creusa appears to Aeneas in his panic. Although an imago, a ghost, Creusa consoles her husband in his grief, assuring him that she will now never become a captive of the Greeks. She reminds Aeneas of his heavenly determined destiny, and tasks him with taking care of their son Aeneas. The ghost of Creusa then vanishes from Aeneas' sight, leaving him bereft. It would now be worth spending a minute to remind the viewer of the key characters present in the prescribed text. To give an idea of how Virgil depicts these characters, I will include some key quotations for three of the main players. Some of the main characters who we meet in these extracts are as follows. Aeneas, the eponymous hero of Virgil's epic. He is the son of Venus, a fugitive from Troy, and the future founder of the Roman race. Priam is the elderly king of Troy, whom we see as a brave yet frail old man, vainly attempting to defend his doomed kingdom. Pyrrhus, also known as Neoptolemus, is the violent, savage son of Achilles, brought to Troy after the death of his father. He kills Priam in this section of text and demonstrates a complete lack of compassion, contrary to how Priam describes his illustrious father. Hecuba is the wife of Priam, and her brief speech draws attention to the futility of Priam's martial efforts. The son of Priam and Hecuba, Polites, features in the narrative fleeing from Neoptolemus, and whose slaughter at the altar before his parents' eyes further enhances the savagery and impious behaviour of Achilles' violent son. Creusa is the wife of Aeneas. She becomes separated from him during their flight from the city and reappears in spectral form. Aeneas is the young son of Aeneas who will go on to found Alba Longa. He is also known as Iulus, connecting him to the Julian clan, of which the Emperor Augustus is a part of, via his adoption by Julius Caesar. Finally, Anchises, Aeneas' elderly father, who is carried by the hero as they make their escape from the city. The characterization of Priam, Neoptolemus, and Aeneas are central to the OCR GCSE specification. Later in this presentation I will suggest ways in which one may wish to teach literary analysis, but initially I thought it would be beneficial to highlight some key quotations to which we may wish to refer when describing how Virgil characterizes these three main players. In our portion of the text, Priam is very clearly described as an elderly man whose desire to defend his city is hampered by his age and consequent frailty. Some quotations which highlight this focus on his aged armour and shoulders which tremble because of the weight of this unfamiliar load, especially emphasised by the transferred epithet of his useless sword, It's only useless since he can't muster the strength to inflict a mortal wound. Similarly, the description of the youthful armour draws attention to his advanced age. Despite this, we are reminded of Priam's bravery in the face of danger, as the double negative of non-nec draws attention to his defiant actions against Pyrrhus, with the Hendiadys of Vociiraeque really hammering home his lack of fear. Sadly, a reminder of the ineffectual spear thrown sine ictu reminds us of the futility of the aged king's actions. An interesting side note, which you might wish to discuss with your class, is the way in which Priam is described after his death at the hands of Pyrrhus. Although being stabbed in the side in the city of Troy, stabbed up to the hilt, Virgil compares him, or describes the body as a headless corpse, a trunk lying on the beach. Your students may rightly ask, why is he suddenly on a beach? Where is his head gone? This is likely an allusion to the murder of Pompey Magnus, Caesar's rival, upon Pompey's arrival at Alexandria. This quotation could be a really interesting or useful jumping off point for discussing some paralinguistic material with your students. Virgil's depiction of Priam's killer, the bloodthirsty Neoptolemus, or Pyrrhus as we see, the son of Achilles, also provides a good basis for discussion. The poet uses animalistic imagery to highlight the bloodlust and savagery of the young man, with such terms as kaides to describe his attack on Polites, and the fervour with which he hounds the young prince, being akin to hunting dog after his quarry. As Aeneas relates the spitting scorn of Priam in his address to Pyrrhus, we should take note of the fricatives of foidasti funere, emphasizing or enhancing the grotesque savagery of the young man and the disdain from Priam in this section. In response, however, Pyrrhus's arrogance and his disregard for the old man come across in his confident future tense verbs coupled with the imperatives, which cast away any potential respect which he would or should be demonstrating for the elderly king. In fact, his sarcastic description of himself as degenerate Neoptolemus completes this image of haughty aggression. Our presentation of Aeneas in these lines can offer an interesting discussion point. Traditionally, students would associate heroes with dynamic deeds, acts of bravery, glorious combat. Our image of Aeneas is one of piety and empathy, as shown through the manner in which he attempts to alleviate his father's concerns and stressing the communal nature of the danger which he and his followers will share. The piety becomes even more apparent when he tasks Anchises with carrying the household gods, as his hands are soiled with blood from combat. The chiasmus, also evident in omnes terrent aurae sonus excitat omnis, hammers home to the student that our hero is experiencing what could almost be described as an insubstantial and intangible fear, raising the question, is this heroic, or is this what we would expect from a hero? Aeneas' fear becomes more evident when he describes his confused mind as he hurls his shouts which fill the streets, calling to his lost wife Creusa. The visual imagery here really heightens the idea of Aeneas' desperation as he searches for his wife again and again, but all in vain. The iterumque gives a beautiful picture of Aeneas' frantic efforts in order to find or search for his wife. Once the ghost of Creusa does appear to him, our protagonist is described as having a wholly physical reaction, displaying his fear with hair on end and voice stuck in his throat. Our students are certainly now invited to ask, what makes a hero, and does Aeneas conform to our expectations? So, teaching the text. While there are no right and wrong ways to teach literature, I would like to share with you some techniques I've used in the past which have seemed to work, or at least intrigue the students and allow them to engage in a further discussion and gain a bit of familiarity with the text. So the way we'll do this is by covering what one could do before meeting the text, during the process of learning, and as a means of reviewing and consolidating material. As you can see, there are some ideas to do with each. This will be quite a quick run through of these ideas, but you can look online for similar concepts which could expand upon what's being described here. So, before. When diving headfirst into a text, students at GCSE may be overwhelmed by the unfamiliarity of the vocabulary, especially with verse, and find this a barrier to understanding the meaning of the text. The cognitive overload can often hamper any efforts made by a student to understand what's going on. So what one can do is provide students with a vocabulary list in advance, perhaps broken down into words from a group of 10 lines or so. If you set this as a homework beforehand, either for a formal test in your lesson, or what I think is a bit more useful, a more informal class quiz, where members of the class are offering translations for some of the Latin words you have on the board, you're able to spot words which have been most clearly remembered and the ones which have been a bit more tricky for your students. Once you've completed the quiz, you can ask the students what they think might occur within the given lines based on the vocabulary which they have covered, which gives them a good opportunity to use deductive reasoning in the form of quite a low-risk activity. With the scaffolding in place, you can now reveal to them the selected lines for that lesson or for the period of time which you want to cover, and hopefully there will be a greater degree of confidence from the class, and they will be able to make a bit shorter work of the text with whatever degree of guidance is appropriate from the teacher. My advice during this part of the lesson as well would be that the students annotate along with the teacher, but not during the lesson write a hard and fast translation. That is something which can be left as a homework task, as a means of consolidating what they have learnt. At my school, students have a tendency to arrive to the lessons in drips and drabs from various different parts of the school. So a wonderful way to get children engaged as they enter the classroom is to show an example of a visual stimulus. Linking it to the previous lesson is a great means of recalling short-term information and encourages students to think in a slightly different manner from just seeing the written word. In the past, I've asked students to write down what they see happening in a picture, which may be related to our recently learned text, particularly English phrases which they can remember from the text if they can, but also potentially Latin items of vocabulary or even phrases from the text itself which relate to the image. You could go beyond this and ask any variety of questions to spark conversation as well. Note the two pictures at the bottom of the screen here, which show the parallel tradition of Neoptolemus using the baby Astyanax as a gruesome weapon with which to bludgeon King Priam to death. Now, these splash pages don't just have to be used at the beginning of a lesson. They could be used either to recap previously learned material or as a means of asking the students what they think will happen next. Maybe they could recognize characters based on the clothing they're wearing, the way in which they look. For example, the character of Priam here is fairly evident by his age and frailty in these pictures, and the brutality of Neoptolemus of Pyrrhus shines through in all four of these images. During the learning of text, one of the greatest challenges I've found is equipping students with the right vocabulary and register in English to describe and analyze how Virgil is producing certain effects in the literature. Quite often the students aren't familiar with the academic register themselves. They won't know instinctively, and it's up to us as teachers to effectively model a response with which the students will then be able to become familiar. This is in keeping with educational psychologist Barak Rosenstein's concept of I do, we do, you do, to equip learners with the correct skills to learn a concept. While students may have existing experience with discussing literary analysis in prose set text, verse has a greater opportunity for discussion of literary devices, but must be led by the teacher to begin with. One of my observations from teaching literary analysis is that students like to latch onto terminology without fully being able to explain the effect of each particular literary device. It's almost like bingo for them, where they will shout out tautology or hendiadys and not really know what the effect is within that section of text. As such, it's crucial that we model for the learner's benefit and do so by first talking through an example, verbally explaining the thought process, and then a second example can be done, incorporating responses from the class. Again, the teacher selecting students to maybe fill in the gap or finish a sentence, for example. And these responses would be given in a structured or as a structured opportunity to assist in the process. Lastly, when the teacher is confident the class has understood the principle, the students can attempt the task by themselves. So I do, we do, then you do. An example of this could be when explaining how the first quotation, which I showed earlier, highlights Priam's frailty and insufficient vigor to defend the city. You might draw attention to specific words and verbally explain how choice vocabulary or literary devices add to the effect created by Virgil. So you would see the quotation, you would have the quotation on the board, and you could either type in real time a response which would fit the parameters of the question, or alternatively you could give it as a verbal response to the class. Following on from this, you could bring up a second quote and begin a sentence such as, Priam's defiance is evident in the manner in which he ... and then you would choose a student to finish that phrase. And this could be done several times, prompting with appropriate sentence introductions and inviting other students to critique or improve upon existing responses. And then the third level, the you do, would be for the teacher to provide a final quotation and ideally a specific question, which then could be answered by the students individually. After the text. So this is not necessarily once the entirety of the set text has been finished, but once you and the students have maybe gone through a selection of lines which you then want to use as a revision or a consolidation tool. It's often not very beneficial to ask a class whether they have any questions, or making the assumption that, quote unquote, we all understand, yes, after one explains a concept. We all know students, they're far more likely to either say no questions or remain quiet. So it's far more effective to assess understanding by selecting individual students to respond to such questions. For example, remind me, James, what about this particular phrase helped us realize that Priam is an old man, or such. The teacher can then bounce further questions around the class, building answers as we go on. However, a tool I found incredibly useful during remote teaching was Microsoft Forms, in particular the multiple choice function. While multiple choice questions are often given short shrift by virtue of seeming too easy for kids, a multiple choice question can be phrased in such a way which prompts a lot of higher order thinking. So the function as a clear and quick way of checking for learning and identifying students' gaps or gaps in students' knowledge is really beneficial as well. In addition, these provide immediate feedback, and you can tailor responses or branching from responses to aid in further development. There are some very informative videos on YouTube which you might wish to watch to learn how exactly to put these together. And similar options are available with different platforms such as Google Classroom or other online multiple choice generators. Here's an example of a multiple choice question designed to test the student's knowledge of the Latin quotations, coupled with their assessing their recall of the literary analysis. So the question could be, which of the quotations below is least helpful in portraying Priam's age? Often an odd one out question is useful as a means of getting the student to examine all four options and use their understanding to single one out, which can then introduce a class discussion if enough students select an incorrect answer. So rather than just having the students do the task, it is very, very important, probably quite obviously, to check what answers they've given. It can prompt a very good opportunity to discuss in the next lesson, or to immediately cast aside any misconceptions. Now, dual coding is a huge topic in its own right, but in its most simple form, dual coding could be described as a combination of media to promote the recollection of material. This is most clearly done by using images to prompt cognitive recall. So whether this is a splash page at the beginning of the lesson, like I showed earlier in the presentation, which reminds students about prior material, or selecting a group of images to depict the action of a narrative, almost like a comic strip, students will benefit not only from seeing these already made, but arguably more so from the thought process behind identifying elements of the text and selecting an image accordingly, or actually unpacking what the text really means and finding less literal, more figurative pictures to go along with it. It can be scaled up or down depending on the confidence of the students or the difficulty of the text at hand. You may want to start off with 5 images for a set section of text, and then see if you can pare it down so that invariably one image can, for the student, describe a long sequence of text or a selection of action. So this example, created by a student from a previous year group, shows a series of 5 images, which you can get from the nounproject.com, which I like to use, which reflects the action of the text immediately above. And hopefully when looking at those 5, you should be able to see what the student had in mind, which particular images correspond to sections of text. It's all linear, so that's all in the order the text produces it. But in addition to being quite helpful, it's also quite fun to see the ideas that the kids come up with. So that element comes from a wider document which the students were asked to produce as a means of consolidation at the end of studying the text, which incorporated sample content questions and analysis points as well. So the students were also asked to provide summaries, make their own questions based on a template which was given to them, and then also identify examples of stylistic devices. This formed a mini booklet which the students were able to refer to when revising the material. In the CPD folder there will be examples such as this, and also other relevant material for today's talk. A final means of checking understanding, which I've enjoyed using during remote sessions, remote teaching, has been asking students to record audio notes. This can be done using OneNote, iPhone, Flipgrid, etc. There are a variety of different ways. And this can be done as an end of section task, or once the text has been fully covered. It identifies gaps in students' understanding and rewards clarity of expression and explanation. As with the previously mentioned Rosenstein principle, it relies on effective modelling beforehand by the teacher, but students can come into their own with this task. Some who may not have the confidence to volunteer answers in class can demonstrate a solid grasp of the material when given this reasonably low risk option or task to do. The recording of notes can also be very useful from the perspective of a teacher, as in when providing feedback. Due to the brevity of the action, it actually takes a lot less time to record a quick note than it does to write or type feedback, and it's also much more personalized. So this is something which you might wish to consider purely as a means of giving feedback. But for students, it becomes very, very clear to check which of the students have understood the text and the analysis thoroughly and who can explain what is taking place, rather than those who are simply describing the action. And obviously this is a very important distinction when looking at 8-mark questions, for example. You want to be able to encourage the students to explain the text rather than merely repeating what action is going on. Well, I hope this has been a useful talk and that you've been able to take 1 or 2 ideas for your own teaching. Although this is the last year of the current set text, Aeneid 2, you can hopefully adapt the suggestions for use with next year's material if desired. In the CPD folder you'll be able to have access to a booklet I use with my students, the first half of which is designed for learning the content of the text, the latter half designed for going through and understanding the literary analysis element. But you can take it, adapt it for your own purposes, along with a selection of possible 8 and 10-mark questions which you may wish to incorporate in your lessons. Thank you, and good luck with teaching this very exciting set text.